welcome to the next in a series of the Randstad Leader Connect webinars. My name is Paul Dupuis. I'm the Managing Director and CEO of Randstad India. Very pleased to be joined today by our two special guests here in today's webinar. This is Professor Raghunath, Professor of Strategy and Chairperson at the Center for Corporate Governance and Citizenship at the India Institute of Management, Bangalore. Professor Raghu has more than 3 decades of experience as a strategy implementation consultant, as a senior leadership team coach, and he's also been an independent board member of banks, venture capital, and on corporate boards. Professor Raghu, welcome back.
Thank you.
And we also have Vinay. Thank you. We also have Vinay Kumar with us today. Vinay is the founding director at C2C which is an organizational development consulting firm. He has held leadership positions as CXO in the services, education, and banking industries. For the last 12 years, Vinay has been working with organizations and the C-suite in helping increase effectiveness and make sure their talent development activities align with organizational strategy. It's a key theme for today, in fact, as we look to the future. He's also the current global chair of the International Association of Facilitators. Welcome, Vinay.
Hi, everyone.
So we are coming to you live from Bangalore. I'm, as I mentioned earlier, based here in Bangalore. I was in Japan previously for more than 20 years. I've worked across the Asia Pacific region in many countries, here in incredible India now for 3 years and counting. Just before we get into it, I want to say, first of all, welcome to the viewers across borders. We have quite an international audience here today. And in fact, we've set a record with this one. We've got about 1,000 people in this webinar today. So thank you all for joining. Clearly, this topic is important, it's timely, and it's a chance for leaders to come together and share ideas and best practices. 2 weeks ago, we had a webinar right here with Vinay and Professor Raghu, and we talked about leadership in crisis, leadership during crisis. The COVID-19 crisis is in many ways unprecedented. I think all of us, at least on this panel here, and certainly many of you watching the webinar here today, have experienced crises in the past. And depending on your age, I guess, and level of experience, you would have experienced perhaps 9/11, the dot-com bubble, H1N1, SARS, of course, the global financial crisis. I was in Japan for 2 big earthquakes in 1995, again in 2011, and the tsunami and the nuclear meltdown that happened afterwards. We do see some similarities, but there are some key differences in this one. Professor Raghu, I'm going to go to you, and just to get your thoughts on what you've seen over the recent months, and of course, what you expect will be next. What are your thoughts?
Right. So thank you very much, Mr. Paul, for setting the tone of the entire conversation. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you who have joined us on this webinar. In the previous webinar, what we essentially did was to paint the scenario where primarily we had leadership challenges both at the corporate level and at the societal level. It was both in terms of physicality and managing one's mental activities and the emotions that come with it. And that being the case, it has been a situation where disruption in terms of a lockdown and continuity of essential supplies and services has been a societal challenge, and the containment of the virus and the survival anxiety has been at its peak. That being the case, we have got into a situation where the famous trendsetter observer Edel Crute said that it seems we are massively entering a quarantine of consumption, an era of quarantine of consumption, which is basically rooted in distancing, minimalism, and parsimony. And the mobility-based consumption society has somehow changed its behavior, because earlier we were into a zone of unbridled consumption, availability-based consumption, but now we are moving on to a zone of moderate consumption. If anything and everything that we consumed in terms of products and services depended upon mobility. We now enter into an era of survival and wellness-based consumption, where there is hyper consumption in areas which have to do with one's health, with one's longevity, with one's wellness, and in anything and everything that can promote work from physically distancing oneself. That being the case, what we are now facing as a scenario is that amongst all the stakeholders, the community now comes first, starting from large companies like Unilever and small ones like small and medium ones like Thermax Corporation, all have started looking at supporting the workers of their stakeholders in the form of suppliers, small and medium enterprises. In other words, the entire movement is about helping those that need help the most. That being the case, it's an interesting scenario if we were to look at business leaders at the global scenario and how we are connected. If you look at the production of value added or final products, we have a pure domestic trade, and India, fortunately, is shielded in a major way because we do not depend too much upon our foreign trade in terms of what happens with our GDP. However, we are also involved in traditional trade and the global value chain. And traditional trade basically is about supplying for cost broader consumption and also participating in intermediate products and services, which actually go into simple global value chains where the product is finally made in different destinations. But we also participate in areas where the product itself, which is made in a different destination, again gets re-exported to a different destination, and which is about this complex global value chain. The interesting thing to note is for each year when the global real trade growth was faster, it had to do something to do with what happened with the complex GVC activities. The complex GVC activities had the highest growth rate in terms of all the four activities, and it went faster than the global real GDP growth. In other words, when the global real GDP growth falls, this complex GVC activities will also take a hit. So which presents us with a scenario where we got to be really thinking about how are we connected with some of these majorly COVID hit countries, with all these major countries which actually constitute 60% of world supply and demand, 65% of world manufacturing, and 41% of world manufacturing export. So it all depends upon whether we are nested in domestic trade or are we connected to global trade and to this complex global value chain. Thank you, Mr. Paul.
Thank you, Professor. Loud and clear, and really interesting comments you made. I'm gonna focus in on a couple of things that you said. One is you mentioned Unilever and you talked about people. What I'm seeing in my conversations daily with CEOs and CXOs is that the companies that are getting this right, the crisis, immediately defaulted towards safety first and people first. So all of the energy was focused on ensuring that the teams were safe, that they were well taken care of. Certainly, when you look at isolation, regardless of whether it's India or anywhere else, it can bring challenges, especially for people who live alone that are isolated, and also living away from family. And you have people living across borders, well away from family, and there's the stress of being alone in a foreign place. So making sure the teams were safe, that's the most important step. And then what we saw is the next phase, and this is in recent weeks, where it went to the next phase, which was really being connected. The ability to be connected, of course, that means the hardware and the software and the technology to do that. Something like we're using right now, although it's not flawless, as we discovered here, but it works, we work through it. And then the third stage was really about how do we then engage with these people? They're safe, they're connected, how do we engage with them? And we're seeing a lot of talk about how to conduct virtual meetings, how to then lean towards not only engagement, but then the next phase, which is productivity. And I heard in my opening, I'm not sure if everyone was able to hear it, but I heard an interesting acronym yesterday. One is BC, before COVID, DC, during COVID, AC, after COVID. And it got me thinking about leadership during each of those phases. And it requires a different type of leadership. So, while we're still talking about during COVID, because in a moment we're going to talk about after COVID, we talk about during COVID, an acronym, work from home, WFH, was relatively known before, but certainly it wasn't known on a global scale. It certainly is now. Everyone uses WFH as part of the normal vernacular. And work from home has brought on some opportunities, but also some challenges, right? Of course, there's the technology piece, but it's also led to some anxiety, stress, and even in some cases depression. And it's given birth to this need for extra care for those employees or members of the organization that are working from home and feeling the stress. So we have a question on this from one of our participants here today. This is from Pradeep Mukim. He's the CEO of Ownip Lifestyle Private Limited. The question is, what can organizations do to help employees heal emotionally and psychologically from the impact of COVID-19? And how can organizations help them build resilience? Vinay, we'll start with you.
Sure. Great question. In fact, I think this is absolutely critical for organizations and for employees. So I would say, early on in my career, when I was a university student, I actually took counseling courses, and I was a certified counselor. And one of the first steps that I always heard about was talk about it. Acknowledge the anxieties, acknowledge the mental pressures that people are having. So I think one of the most important things for organizations and leaders is to provide spaces for employees to talk about the anxieties they're having. It's one of the fundamental things about the mental well-being of professionals today. The second one is also help employees through the planning stages for whatever may be next, exploring options. So I think it's critical for organizations, and HR and leaders will need to drive it to just create spaces for people to talk about what they're going through. And Paul, you mentioned WFH. I actually say it's WFFH, work for and from home. Most of us are also, we used to talk about work-life balance, and I've heard the expression work-life integration. This is the best time in the world where we're living work-life integration on a daily basis. And I'm hearing across the board that most people are working longer hours sitting at home.
Yeah.
They're not shutting off. So what are leaders doing today to tell employees, 7 to 9 p.m. or after 6:30 p.m., we're not going to be doing emails, guys.
Yeah, it's an interesting point, Vinay. And I think you're right. I think the leaders need to set that tone in the organization. This is not something we had to do before as leaders when we go back to the brick and mortar approach, where you go to a workplace. You can see people physically, and you can kind of, you can see their activities, and you can see just how much they're working. But when people are working from home, what we're discovering too is that leaders are struggling with how to manage that. And busy for the sake of being busy is a trap that a lot of leaders have fallen into. And so we need to caution, as you said, that separation between your work and your workspace in your home and your personal and your family life. Professor Raghu, any thoughts on this? Is a very, very powerful question about healing. That it implies that there's damage done to individuals and therefore the organization.
Exactly. So I think the basic idea is that we've always done task-oriented, transaction-oriented conversations because primarily we are an objective and a mission-driven business unit. I mean, all over the world, that's what happens between leaders and people who report and work with them. I think the time has come for people to actually start bonding not in a very personal sense, but bonding in terms of allowing cathartic space for ventilating, for actually commenting on the experience as it is today. And this despondency which actually brews in managing day-to-day affairs, as Mr. Vinay rightly said, it is for home and from home and whatever else comes up with it. I think the challenges of trying to compartmentalize between what is work and what is non-work in the economic sense is going to be a major challenge. And therefore, in terms of building resilience amongst colleagues, the primary thing is to always bring back the attention to the longer term. So if one could always constantly change the horizon from the immediate and the here and the now, and where everything is falling apart, one can always induce a whole lot of conversation about what can be and what could be, and what might be so different from what we have envisaged so far. There is always a silver lining, there is always an opportunity in a threat. And I think if that kind of a dialogue or a conversation is encouraged and initiated, I think the emotional environment within which a individual functions might improve.
Yeah, again, very interesting point. And I can tell you, leaders that I'm speaking to, including CHROs, they're now working on, many organizations are working on providing EAP, employee assistance programs, and having licensed counselors on call or even on staff post-crisis. So it's one of the questions that came up, how can we prepare? I think it's better to err on the side of caution, particularly if you're running a large organization across borders or in multiple locations. There is the possibility that some of the team members will have experienced quite a high level of anxiety and stress and will need time to recover from this when the crisis indeed ends. And so organizations that put people first during and after the crisis will be ready for the future. There's another interesting question, which is about returning back to full bandwidth. So we talked about healing, but it's also now about future focus. Let's shift the conversation a little bit. The question we have here is from Kartik Kumar, who's the CEO of Gigasoft. The question is, what can organizations do differently to help employees and the partners overcome the adversity mindset sooner for maximized productivity? And I'll comment briefly, and then perhaps Professor Raghu, you can take it. We talk about the adversity mindset. Well, we're in the middle of a crisis, clearly, and that prompts a fight or flight kind of response. We know that. And the stress that this crisis, the ambiguity, the uncertainty of what's going to happen next, and of course that big question: Will I get the virus? Will someone around me, one of my loved ones, get the virus? That's scary, and that causes stress, and that's understandable. Certainly, when we turn on the news, that's all we're seeing is bad news. Number of cases increasing. And when it comes into your world, into your neighborhood, into your community, as we've seen in some cases, the stress level goes up. And so, this adversity mindset, we are fighting a battle, is continuing, and it should. But at the same time, we also need to balance things out. We need to turn off the news. We need to stop watching, the reports of the increased number of cases. It will be there, and do something that kind of is positive, whether it's watch a movie, read a book, pursue your hobby, something to just kind of refresh and reset and recharge. At the same time, when we get back to momentum into the workplace after the crisis, that adversity mindset can clearly slow us down, where we're sort of caught in the crisis, although it's after crisis. Some people might even call it post-traumatic stress disorder. But the point is, how do we get people to move forward post-crisis and move on from that adversity mindset? Professor Raghu, any thoughts on that?
Yeah. So is my
we can
screen
see
being seen?
Go ahead.
Oh yeah.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Yeah, we can see.
So Mr. Paul, when you ask this question, I'm just thinking about you. You are the epitome of what it is to be rugged and energetic. You are the most acclaimed ice hockey player. You are a coach for our national ice hockey team. I think listeners probably are not aware of this. And you're so good in the outdoors. And the whole analogy comes down to, as you said, these are difficult times. This is like rock climbing. And you're trying to reach a certain anchor, a certain goal, milestones being set up. And everybody is trying to take risk very safely. And as leaders, we are just belayers. We are just guys who are going to give them a secure base. And we know how belaying works. There is a rope to climb, and there is a guide hand which is forward. And there is a brake hand which is behind. In other words, we allow enough slack, we allow enough guidance, we allow enough support to the stretch and failure. And on the other hand, we are always keeping the goals in focus. I think this kind of a perspective which allows us as leaders to act as a battery pack, as if we were battery packs to a cell phone, and each one of us is expending a lot of energy in, as Mr. Vinay said earlier, work from home and for home. I think the first thing that we generate in people is to simply stay calm, to accept individuals as they are. We have our own views about what people are good at and not good at. We got to be suddenly moving into seeing potential and not just the past. We got to be more listening and in an inquiry mode than just telling people the way we see it. We've got to deliver powerful messages of looking at the longer horizon. We have to obviously focus on the positive, encourage risk taking, basically inspire intrinsic motivation, and always signaling accessibility. I think that exactly is what is called for when we are in our leadership roles.
Please leave this slide up, Professor. This is a wonderful slide, and I'm sure our participants today are taking this in. Each of these points implies actions that the leader needs to take, and I absolutely agree with you on the first one, staying calm. That then doesn't mean to sugarcoat the situation. Huh? You can be calm in a storm, but admit that it's a bad storm. And as you're the captain of the ship and you're holding that wheel, your team is watching you closely. It's okay to be human. In fact, it's very important for the leader to be human. And through this, a sense of followership is born when the leader is human, when the leader is calm and has conviction and confidence that we will get through this. So I really like this list, and you know, I thank you for this. I think this can be something that could guide many of us as we lead our teams forward. Vinay, coming back to you. I think you're with us on audio now, Vinay.
Yes, I am.
Just on that, oh, there you go. Okay. Just on that question about the adversity mindset, how to overcome it sooner, you know, so we can get back, get the wheels moving, because, you know, at the end of the day, many of us are leading businesses, and in order for the businesses to survive and move forward, it's important that we kind of reignite that engine. How do we get over this adversity mindset post-crisis?
Look, I think, you know, without minimizing the impact of COVID-19 on what's happening, let's put it in perspective. We've had plenty of crises in humanity and in our own lifetimes. And out of every crisis, we've emerged, we've moved forward, we've adapted, and we've evolved. And humanity has that perspective to do that. And the reality, you know, you've all heard the expression, with every challenge comes opportunities. So while we are talking about right sizing the business, right pricing the professions, etc., we also have to have the right mindset. And the ones that will survive and come out the strongest at the end of it are those that are already in the process of creating the right mindset and positioning themselves to do it. It's classical change curve. The earlier you move on the change curve to adapt, the faster you'll be able to perform once we get to the other side. So I think it's really about what we are able to do now that defines what our future is going to be.
Yeah, absolutely. We are laying the foundation for post-crisis. If we go back to that acronym, the during crisis then prepares us for the post or the after crisis. You know, there's a wonderful book by a futurist named Rick Vera, where he talks about this concept of the day after tomorrow. And Rick is a well-known lecturer at London Business School as well. I had the chance to spend time with him when I took a course on transformational leadership. And you know, he talks about organizations that are resilient because they plan for the day after tomorrow. We all know that Moore's law about the rate of technology, you know, doubling and the growth of technology and so on is actually becoming obsolete. The world's changing so fast. That was before COVID-19. Now with COVID-19, everything's been accelerated. This word change is at the center of everything. And so being prepared not only for tomorrow, in the case of, let's say, India, being prepared not only for May 3rd, when the lockdown is planned to be lifted, but being prepared for 6 months, 1 year down the road. It's very important for organizations to start talking about not only tomorrow, but the day after tomorrow. And I really recommend this book. And after this webinar, I'll send you the link to Rick Vera's book. So talking about working from home, well, that was the one acronym, WFH. The other one we've heard a lot over the past couple of months is BCP, Business Continuity Planning. And I will admit to you, as a CEO, when I thought of BCP prior to COVID-19, I immediately thought of technology. I thought of is our infrastructure in place? Can it withstand natural disaster, for example, where we need to continue to deliver? In our case, we put 60,000 people to work every day in India. Around the world, around 800,000 people to work in the 38 countries where Randstad operates. We have to pay those people on time. We have the responsibility to help them provide a livelihood for themselves and their families, and that's the promise we honor no matter what. So BCP for me is about that back end, the ability to deliver. But then COVID-19 woke me up to a new definition of BCP. I've gone from, of course, technology is important, to the other extreme. It's about people. Are we able to protect our people? Are we able to protect our culture? Are we able to be resilient and come out even stronger? So business continuity has quite a deep meaning for me now, and much more dynamic. Professor Raghu, this leans into the question of preparedness. We have a question. We have a question from Vinay Kumar. He's the CHRO of Newberg Engineering. The question is, how can global organizations help minimize the impact of a catastrophe of this proportion again? What strategies, planning approaches do you suggest?
Exactly.
We're talking about.
So,
go ahead. Yep. Go ahead.
Sorry. You were saying something. Yeah. No.
I was just going to say that it's hard. I have a flashback back to the many unpredicted challenges that I faced in my career, whether again it was 9/11, H1N1, SARS, .com burst, GFC, the earthquakes. There's that old saying that you can't control what happens to you, but you can control how you respond. So certainly being prepared as possible is going to be an advantage, right, for any organization, particularly when the crisis ends. So maybe you can make some comments on preparedness and what organizations can do.
Exactly. So preparedness obviously comes to a point which is business as unusual, right? And that primarily means that we are trying to make changes in the corporate philosophy. Earlier, looking at environmental crisis, starting from things like a virus or a climate change or other natural disasters, force majeure, as we would say in a clause in terms of contractual obligations. This was never something that we really factored in a major way. So today, there has to be a change in the corporate philosophy, looking at these environmental crisis-inducing factors is not a cost anymore. It is a strategic necessity for ensuring availability of products and our own production and delivery systems. So therefore, if we are looking at firms which are not just production systems, but also in a negative sense, firms which can get paralyzed by these external environments, we've got to be integrating these factors into the management in terms of our corporate excellence program. So when we have our corporate excellence function in very large companies, I think the integration of the external environmental factors and what's going to happen in the future in terms of even looking at strategic planning, we've got to be looking at future environmental scenarios and then see how that would make business as unusual and not as usual. Which would also mean that we get an external perspective from outsiders on the board or on advisory committees that we would develop. And they would bring their expertise, their orientation relating to these various factors to come into play when we are planning ahead. It then also means that we have training and workshops in environmental factor-based crisis management. We have crisis simulations. And it is so important to be looking at diversification in terms of repurposing business, because today the orientation is that if we have current assets and current capabilities, we cannot allow them to go to waste just because the scenario has changed. If I am in tourism, I am in travel, I am in things which have something to do with external congregations as entertainment or in dining, one has to be repurposing. And I think the perspective of constantly looking at diversification and changing the portfolio is something that we have to orient our thinking to going forward.
Great, thank you, Professor. I think you raise a very good point about, let's call it the risk hedge and the risk exposure that we have as organizations. One thing is about our products and our services. If you're a manufacturer, for example, how do you manufacture when the government orders a complete lockdown and you're not an essential service? We simply can't. You know, is there an alternative? Is there something else you can do to protect the business? Same thing goes with services, right? So if your service requires face-to-face contact, how can you adapt and adjust in a situation like we're in right now? And you know, organizations are being creative right now because they're forced to be. I want to comment, Vinay, before I go to you on a similar topic. Is, you know, in my role, again, when we talk about putting people to work, a lot of companies, a lot of leaders are approaching us now saying, you know, how can we support this workforce while we don't have, we're not operational? And that's a tough question. And many organizations will lean to the default, which is kind of the textbook response, which is to cut the workforce, to trim the workforce. And I would caution organizations on that. There's a few reasons for that. And we found this in the GFC. We found this in crises over the generations, that the organizations that put people first no matter what are the organizations that go on to accelerate and excel and take leading positions in their industry. So another way to put it is short-term pain for long-term gain. But this particular pain is worthwhile. We're talking about protecting people. And people, as we know, it's not just an adage, people are our most important resource. Because when the bounce back happens, we all will need people that are fully productive, that are fully engaged to help take us forward. The bounce back will happen. It's been proven. If you look at the GFC, for example, it took about 9 months for things to completely crash, but it was a gradual crash, right? The bounce back took about 18 months. So 18 months after the worst point in the GFC, including the fall of the stock market. It was 18 months to get back to the same levels and then exceed. And of course, we all know what happened after that. It's basically been a bull economy since then in most markets. So we expect that the speed of this fall has been faster than anything we've ever seen, much faster than the GFC. We expect the bounce back as well to be pretty quick, particularly when consumers start consuming again, when the trucks are on the road, when the manufacturers are making product and shipping it. So I think it's very important to not to default to downsizing the workforce. One solution, creative solution, is to think about workforce planning. This is part of preparedness. If you put your workforce onto a pie chart and you say how many, what percentage of our workforce are core full-time employees versus contractual workers versus temp versus gig workers, for example, how much of that can be outsourced, for example. These are the kinds of things that leading edge organizations are thinking about right now in terms of their preparedness. And, you know, I'm supporting, and our team is supporting organizations that are thinking about this as part of their BCP, as part of their preparedness. But again, I caution and I urge leaders who are on this webinar today to rethink the default reaction to trim down your workforce. Your people are your most important asset, and we must protect them at all costs. Tough decisions ahead for sure. Vinay, there's a question here from Pratik Nagar. He's the CMO of Boozy. Question is, what are some of the key elements that organizations need to focus on for business resurgence after COVID-19?
Great, good question. And for those of you who are watching, I'm not trying to be shy and be off video. I'm having some bandwidth challenges, which is why I decided to just stay on audio.
No, we've got you fine. Yeah, go
okay.
for it.
So, you know, that's a great question, Pratik. And one of the things that I would just say is, post-COVID-19, when it happens, I think every organization needs to have a time for pause, reflect, and learn from what we have just gone through. What did we just learn from this experience? This is going to be very, very critical. And Paul, I agree with you 100%. One of the benefits I'm seeing, I am heartened by the fact that in the last 2 days, I had conversations with 2 clients who are still doing lots of onboarding and virtual onboarding of people rather than focus on letting people go. One of the number one element that organizations need to focus on is how can we learn to be much more agile. One thing COVID-19 has taught us is agility. How can we get business to be agile, people to be agile, skills to be agile, financial models to be agile across the board? But before we get into agility, pause, reflect, and learn and apply the learnings.
Yeah, I think it's a very good point, Vinay. And just to close off the comment that I made earlier about workforce planning, this is not to say that we tolerate non-performance. I think all of us who are leading or on our journey from good to great are all aiming to lead high-performance organizations. That does mean tough decisions, that need to be made. And I think it also comes back to questioning each and every single role in the organization. Is the role necessary? Is the role as it's currently constructed and the deliverables for that role, is that the same in this new world of business unusual, the new normal, which will be quite unusual for all of us, which is an opportunity. It's a chance to rethink. It's also a chance to rethink our footprint. And I can tell you, as a company like Randstad, we have a huge amount of offices around the world, and our physical footprint is quite big. That's part of the tradition of our company. This crisis has woken us up to the possibility of providing the same high level of service, but doing it virtually. So it kind of brings up that question of, can we use tech for better touch? And how do we do that? And then we kind of redesign not only the workforce itself, but the workplace. So it raises interesting questions. And I think these are exercises that organizations can do as well. But I come back to my original point: protect the people, especially your high performers. This is not the time to be downsizing your workforce and risk losing high performance. Also remember Professor Raghu's slide about leadership competencies. The leaders that show calm, that lean towards protecting the people first, being engaged, being connected, those leaders will build a powerful sense of followership through this crisis and beyond. And that followership then builds productivity, builds new ideas, creativity, and commitment. So that's very important moving forward. Okay, we've got a lot of questions coming in here, guys. So just give me 1 second. I'm going through here. All right, so here's a question about getting back to normalcy. And I know we all have a question about this word normalcy, because it's, our world has been completely flipped upside down. But I'll pose the question. This is from Vaneet Patil. He's the CMO of laundrocart.com. How long do you think it will take for large organizations, particularly, to bounce back to normalcy in business after COVID-19? For the engines to kind of come back on and get rolling. At the same time, how long will it take for the small and medium-sized businesses? Professor Raghu, you want to give your thoughts on this one? How long will it take for us to kind of get back up and running?
Yeah, so the way today the Prime Minister was in his conversation with the nation, and he clearly laid out that they're going to observe areas as being red, yellow, and not exactly that way, but green zones, and then they're going to support those areas which do not show a casualty or a widespread virus. So I guess pretty much all this is very locational today, and the orientation of small and medium enterprises obviously is going to be in terms of the support that they get from the people who are larger in the value chain. So it is going to call for support at least for the next 3 to 6 months, if not to 3 quarters. And the large companies, obviously the ones who are linked with international deliveries and who have work to do, are going to be dictated by the economies and the indicators there in those home countries, because India is actually a host country. And the rest of us who are in this area of wellness and encouraging physical distance, so anything which goes into online, anything which actually allows remote working, anything which supports healthcare, starting from healthcare technology, looking at healthcare equipment, healthcare consumables, and hospitals themselves, everything to do with wellness, remote wellness, not just gyms, but remote gyms, so to say. And all of that connected business will actually see a revival very fast, because today, as you notice, it is the logistics and the distribution, or the last mile, which is preventing online based businesses to actually deliver. And that could be pretty quick. It could be as easy as making sure that there are areas where movement is possible. And if the policy on movement undergoes change, then obviously businesses will bounce back in a quarter.
Thank you. Vinay, any thoughts on how long it will take for companies to bounce back and resurge?
Yeah, sure. I think, Paul, you used the word normalcy, and it's, I think, then the question as well. I think we need to define what the next normal is going to look like, what the economic conditions are going to look like. So how long will it take, particularly the SMBs, to bounce back? It is going to be dependent on how adaptable are these SMBs to the new economic conditions that may emerge. How quickly can they adapt their business models, and maybe there's new opportunities, new offerings. The quicker they can do it, the quicker the bounce back will be.
You know, it's interesting when you look back to the global financial crisis and the bounce back trend. And Professor, you listed up a number of countries in one of your slides, which is quite interesting. I was sort of running through it in my head, and I've either lived or worked in many of those countries. The speed of bounce back, let's call it to normal, but at least to momentum and accelerating, is a direct reflection of the resilience of that economy, right? And of course, then it comes down to the people, and I would say then to the organizations within that economy. What we do know is that the small, medium-sized enterprises are the heart and soul of every economy. The large corporations, of course, are the big whales, they're the big ships, and they're the stewards. We need them, of course, to guide the economy forward. But what really fuels that engine and accelerates are the SMEs. And what I'm pleased to see is that most governments, if you look at that list of countries that you listed up, whether it's from Japan to Italy to the US to India and so on, China, governments are supporting, announcing initiatives, stimulus programs, which have a heavy focus on these small and medium-sized enterprises. Right down to mom and pop shops. These, again, this is the heart and soul of the economy. The moment the lights come back on and the machines are turned on and so on, then this fuel starts to really generate momentum. And I absolutely agree with you. Wait until we see Amazon's numbers for this quarter. They're going to be off the charts because people had no choice but to order online. So anybody who's in e-commerce will continue to see a boom. We know that. Fast-moving consumer goods, retail, and so on. Same thing happened in previous crises, whether it was the earthquake again, the GFC, and other things that I've sort of seen over the years. When people are finally able to get back into the shopping malls, the numbers will spike. And part of that is behavior. Part of that is psychological. Let's keep in mind that the world is essentially shut down for an extended period of time. So when the doors are unlocked and people are able to get out, we know that there will be certain behaviors that are predictable. I think organizations need to prepare for that outcome, and that will come. What we don't know is when, and I hesitate to answer that question on how long will it take to return to normalcy. Again, I don't think there will ever be a normal as we knew it before. We're going to create the new normal. But you know, at the current pace, the modeling shows every country on a different trajectory. You know, optimistic, I think what Professor Raghu said, you know, 1 quarter is probably optimistic. But when the doors are open, there will be this gradual, you know, return to momentum. And that's what we're all looking forward to when it's the right time. So I have questions coming in. In fact, I've got questions coming at me from different angles, including directly from this webinar and also some WhatsApp. So here, I'm going to take one question here for you. When we come back, how do we foster a culture of getting back together and proximity rather than social distancing? Are people going to be skeptical? Are they going to avoid getting closer to their colleagues? Or will there be a fear of getting closer to their colleagues? And if so, what's the way out? This is from Arvind Bhatt. Gentlemen, who would like to take this? A really interesting question. Huh?
So can I take that, Paul?
Yeah, go for it, Vinay.
So I'll just share what's happening in China, because they're coming back, right? And what they're doing is, I was speaking to colleagues in Beijing and Shanghai and a few other places, and I'm getting messages, my friends saying, finally, 4 of us managed to get together and go to a restaurant and have a meal. But we were in a table that seats 8, and we had to have a chair in between us, right? So there is this hunger to be able to get out there and face-to-face connect with others. The norms in how we connect might change. In my industry, for example, training workshops and learning and development workshops or strategy workshops are back in Beijing and Shanghai. But in rooms that could, where you could have 25 people, they're now putting in only 12 people, and they're just encouraging a little bit more of physical distancing. So I want to caution the use of social distancing and promote the word of physical distancing, because social connecting will still happen, but physical distancing norms may continue for a while longer.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, there is this question again of post-traumatic stress disorder and so on. People are afraid that is the virus really gone? We can expect that sort of thing to happen. Professor Raghu, what do you think about this one? It's an interesting question, which I hadn't thought of so much. Are people going to be hesitant to be together again when the government and authorities deem it's okay?
Right. So I think all this is a function of the awareness levels amongst people. And unless people understand the fatality and the seriousness of this COVID strain, which is very different from the normal flu, the Indian need for socializing is not going to go down. And also, it is primarily necessity driven. You know, if you look at poor families, and if you look at the physical space that they have to even socialize, and a larger part of our community consists of people who do not have enough space, more so in very large metropolitan cities. This is something that they might probably have in their mind, but may not get to execute it in the way it's happening, because it's the government and its ability to enforce which is driving the anti-Indian behavior. I call it anti-Indian because Indians would socialize at a drop of a hat. Which is much against their grain, that they are managing to stay away. I don't think this memory is going to be long. It's extremely short. The tendency is to socialize not just on the net, but actually socialize pretty high.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you raised a very good point. And go ahead, Vinay. Vinay, go ahead.
Yeah, if I can just add, I think we'll socialize, but our consciousness of hygiene and protection will increase dramatically. So if you are a hand sanitizer company, I think there'll be lots more people carrying hand sanitizers with them wherever they go.
Yeah, right? So, yeah, it's a good point. It's a good point. I was just going to offer my, I'd say outside in, inside out perspective. I'm living in India for a few years now. I've lived across most of Asia and Japan in many ways an extreme. But one thing is universal is people do want face-to-face contact. It's part of being human, huh? Regardless of our culture. And I think that in India, particularly, like you said, people, this must be very tough for a lot of people. But when the doors open, watch out. Yeah. So anybody who's involved with anything related to consumption, post-crisis, watch out. There was a question here, which I found really interesting, which was, what is, let me just find it here. What is, just bear with me for 1 second. Yeah, the question is from Lionel Paul David. He's the head of HR at Olam GBS. The question is, how is your organization planning today for the COVID-19 scenario? And that's a great question. I'd like to share what Randstad is doing. So certainly from a global perspective, as a company, you know, we've established our BCP, our version of BCP steer codes regionally, but also globally. And I'm on those calls several times a week. We first learn from each other, and it's amazing what you can learn from other organizations. I encourage everyone on this webinar not to hesitate to please reach out to colleagues in your own organization, but also outside associations you may belong to as well. And also look at your industry and how organizations are handling this. We learn a lot from each other. There's no need to reinvent the wheel, and we do that as Randstad as well. One of the things that we are very clear on, we will hold firm on our position that safety first, people first. So we will not open up our offices until we're 100% sure that our people will be safe and that the offices themselves will be safe zones. And so we're already in this phase of preparing for that. And that implies a need to procure some goods to protect these offices. Everything from sanitizers, as Vinay just said, having a security system in place in every office that is less about security, but more about making sure that we're keeping the office as a clean and safe zone, that people have the opportunity to sanitize and so on. and that we take extra precautions on cleaning the office as well. We started to do that just before the lockdown happened. Once an hour, every single office, every single desktop, every single door handle, elevator button, and so on was wiped down and sanitized in the building. I think this is going to be a new normal. Absolutely. Having masks on hand for those who want them. We may even encourage it in the beginning until we're absolutely sure the virus is gone. These are the kinds of things that we can do. I think we also need to look at being more flexible, introducing the concept of flex time. Many organizations already have it, some don't. I think if you don't have it, good idea to look at it. Another one is to stagger the return. While the government may say we're open, let's go, you may want to stagger, just as many organizations did before the crisis, before we went into full lockdown, where you may have 50% of your workforce in the building at a time, 50% working from home, and then switch. May offer the opportunity to work from home, but I think it was a perk back pre-COVID-19 for many organizations to work from home. I think it absolutely needs to be an option for performers to work from home, and that's something a role that may have traditionally been in a seat could now be offered to be a work from home or a virtual work arrangement, or it could be both. We could offer the flexibility to work from home a certain number of days a week and so on. So I think these are all things that we're constructing now, but I absolutely am connecting with leaders every single day to learn about what they're doing in their organizations. And there's an old saying, stand on the shoulders of giants, learn from others, and apply it in your own organization. And that's why we're here, by the way, today with this webinar. There's another question here, which I think is really interesting. Customers and clients are an integral part of business. For the survival of today and growth for tomorrow, we need our customers and our clients. In these pressing times, what is your advice on engaging these customers and reassuring them, staying connected with them? This is from Sudipta Mandal, the CHRO of Star Cement, part of the Century Group. Really good question, huh? Absolutely. Our customers and clients are extremely important for business continuity. Again, I'll share something that Randstad is doing, and perhaps Professor Raghu and Vinay, if you have any suggestions. One of the things that we're doing is we're reaching out. There's an old saying that I've held close for many, many years, and I learned this lesson that relationships will serve you well in good times and bad. The relationships we build with our customers that we worked hard to build so far need to be protected and even deepened in this crisis. And I can tell you, sometimes it's hard to set up a meeting pre-crisis, to set up a meeting with a CEO or a CHR or someone in the community because of schedules, always too busy and so on. I'm finding now that a quick text or a quick email and a question, hey, are you free this afternoon for a quick call? I'm getting yes more than ever, because we have found the time for this, and even we're longing for it. So I'm having some great conversations with my customers, my clients, about how they're handling this crisis, trading ideas, having a conversation like this. We don't talk about business. We talk about how we're navigating through the crisis. At one point, when the lights are on and the doors are open, we will talk about business. And the relationships, again, that we continue to build and protect now are extremely important. Professor Raghu, Vinay, any advice or thoughts on that one?
Yeah, so, I would just add. Sorry, go ahead, Professor.
No, it's okay. Yeah, please go ahead. I will follow. Not a problem. Yeah.
Okay, so I would just add, I would echo, Paul, your stay connected. The second is listen to what's keeping them up at night, what their business challenges are, and find some ways to add value to them right now. It doesn't have to be, it could be providing them with connections. It could be just being a sounding board to listen to them. It could be sharing best practices and what you're hearing from others. But I think staying connected, we need them, they need us. It's being part of that ecosystem and adding value to each other. And the value is just is through the relationship and through the connections.
Yeah, absolutely. Professor Raghu, any thoughts on that one?
Yeah. So basically, if we were to look at the kind of engagement that customers have had with their customers, their reality has undergone change. And the more we get connected with their changed reality in terms of their clients, so the customers, and we are then able to bring that data in for us to realign and refocus. I think that's something that would be useful to us as well as to them.
Yeah, well said. Thank you, gentlemen. You know, I've got at least 12 more questions. Some that were submitted before and some that are coming in live now as well. I really appreciate everyone's eager participation. We promised you 1 hour and we're actually at 1 hour now, but we're gonna go over just a few minutes because there's another question I wanna ask. You know, as we're in isolation, clearly, and this is across borders. And again, I mentioned earlier, we have about 1,000 participants in today's webinar, crossing many borders from Japan to Australia to Singapore, of course, here in India, parts of Europe here as well. So thank you all for joining us today. And you know, clearly most countries that I just mentioned now, if not all, are in a lockdown, some form of lockdown or isolation. The government is encouraging social distancing or physical distancing, as Vinay said. So we still have a road ahead of us. With crisis comes opportunity. I can tell you, I've reignited some old hobbies. I picked up my guitar. I started taking online guitar lessons. I'm writing my second book now. You know, these are all things that you could say were born from crisis. And in a way, that's the positive outcome, I guess, of a crisis. But we, you know, I think, as I said earlier, sometimes we need to turn off the news. We need to get away from that negative influence and get some positive input. So I'd like to ask both you, Vinay and Professor Raghu, is there a book or a movie that you would recommend that people, a book they read or a movie that people watch during this crisis? Because again, we have some days ahead of us. Professor Raghu, how about you?
Yes, so I don't know whether you can see this. This is The Unstoppable.
Yeah.
A movie which had Denzel Washington and Chris Pine in it. And the whole thing is about leadership at various levels, all the way down to the operational, all the way up to the strategic and how each one of us in a crisis situation really have to depend on our capabilities and know the limitations to it and allow expertise actually to prevail in terms of addressing the situations which keep arising, because this is a dynamic situation. Unstoppable is a wonderful movie to watch.
It's a great movie. Yeah.
And there is another book called The Return on Courage by Ryan Berman. So this is a guy who has done a great job of gathering information from astronauts, Navy SEALs, CEOs, academics, and community leaders. And it talks about how do you put the principles of courage into practice, regardless of the line of work we are in. It's called Return on Courage. And I think these days require a fair amount of courage and a fair amount of energy to take on the desolation which surrounds us.
Oh, absolutely. Well said. Those are two great recommendations. You're right. I don't think this was ever in anyone's job description, no? But leaders step up in times of crisis. That's when we see what leaders are really made of. Vinay, any recommendations?
Sure. One movie. The movie is The Big Short, which is how the housing bubble caused the global financial crisis. And there's some great insights on looking at data and plan for the future. And the book is Making Habits and Breaking Habits by Jeremy Dean, which is really all about how are we now making new habits for the next normal, and what are some of the habits we could be breaking as well. So those would be my two recommendations.
Good one, good one. Habits are interesting. I think we've all been, regardless of where we're at and watching this call from, we've all created new habits. Huh? Talk about the new normal. We have a very new routine. I'm sure you all would agree. Yeah? The way you run your day now is very different than pre-COVID. And these habits could continue, especially if they're good habits. So let's protect those. Some of the things we've discovered about this new healthy routine that we found, by all means protect it. So the movie I would recommend is a movie called Groundhog Day. It's a movie with Bill Murray. It's quite a funny movie, and it's I think it's very appropriate for our situation. And I won't give the whole story away, but I think anyone who's seen it knows that Bill Murray goes to this little town and something magical happens where he wakes up every day and it's repeated. The exact same day is repeated again and again. But he's the only one that knows. And it's quite a story. Yeah, I encourage you to watch Groundhog Day. Book, I actually have two books. One, I don't have it with me right now, but it's Marshall Goldsmith, the classic, What Got You Here Won't Get You There. I think as leaders, we need to constantly be not reinventing ourselves, but adding muscle. We need to be adding new muscle through new experiences. And we're building some muscle right now. We're building agility. We're building resilience. The ability to steer a ship through ambiguity and adversity is a very important leadership quality. And I think it's an opportunity. So that's one book. The other one is this one. I'm a big believer in purpose. And this is a book by Ben Renshaw. He talks about greater purpose. I would call it your North Star, your true north. What do you stand for as a leader? Define that, make it crystal clear, and it should be at the center of everything you do and all of your decisions. It becomes your guiding principle. So I'm a big believer in purpose. In fact, I'm picking up this book a couple times a day now to revisit the most important thing. And I think it's more important than any of our technical skills that we possess, any of our experience. Ultimately, purpose is at the core of who we are. So by all means, let's revisit our purpose. With that, we're a little bit over time, but I appreciate all of you who have stayed on today with us to the very end. And thank you for your eager participation. Again, so many questions. I guess we could go on for 2 hours. There has been that request from many participants from the previous webinar to go longer, but we will keep it at 1 hour for now, but we certainly will be keen to do another one sometime soon. I want to say thank you, of course, to Professor Raghu and to Vinay for your participation today. Again, in round two, really interesting conversations. I've taken away a couple of really nice golden nuggets, which I'm going to apply right away in my own organization. So thank you, gentlemen. And again, keep your eyes on this space for more webinars to follow on topics that are really relevant, with the key aim to provide some takeaways, things that you can take away and use in your own organizations right away. With that, stay safe, stay healthy, stay at home, and of course, stay positive. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.